Hello, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window in Door, Georgia. Now, I just caught myself because on Friday I told you that I was trying to sort of establish "Good morning, Dog Nation" as like the catchphrase to begin the show. We have a couple of catchphrase type things we maybe do towards the end of the show. In that particular case, I didn't say "Good morning, Dog Nation," so it can't be a catchphrase if I don't say it every single time. So we'll take the L on that today. But the point is, we got a really fun show. Obviously, a lot of this is going to center around a tweet yesterday from ESPN analyst Dan Orlovsky that people who were super plugged into recruiting seemed to get right away. Other folks had a little bit of confusion about, but all seems to point to good things for Georgia eventually with five-star quarterback, nation's number one recruit Dylan Raiola. Why is that? We'll talk about exactly what's going on there about that on today's show. Also, a little bit from Kirby Smart on what's one of the hottest topics out there in college football last couple of years. The Georgia approach, seemingly a little bit different than other programs, but also seemingly an approach that's actually working out pretty well. We'll explain that. Jon Stinchcomb here today there as well. And a whole lot of fun on the Monday after Mother's Day. Hope all of you had a great weekend and getting ready to get settled in for the start of a brand new week. Thank you for allowing us to go along with you as you go through it all. Glad to be with you, in other words. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
You know, it's sort of been a little bit of a quiet weekend. There wasn't a ton going on. Most folks kind of focused in on paying attention to their mothers, their wife, their actual mom, whatever else. And then late yesterday evening, there was a tweet that got a lot of attention. Now, when it comes to stuff like this, there are a couple of pretty well-defined silos that most of our audience sort of finds themselves in. There are some people who know all about this sort of right away. They sort of get all of this right away. There are other people that maybe they're just busy, right? They got full-time jobs, they got families, they got this, they got that. And some of the stuff as it relates to recruiting can be a little too cryptic at times. It can be a little too mysterious at times. And there are a lot of people who, are kind of interested in UGA recruiting, but they sometimes sort of wish that the information was a little bit more matter-of-fact and sort of more clearly stated. So we're going to try to do that here for the next couple of minutes. We're going to try to explain to you why Georgia fans were in a little bit of a sort of a worked-up frenzy late last night. A lot of this generated by ESPN analyst, former quarterback for the Detroit Lions. College, I guess, was at UConn, I believe. Dan Orlovsky. You may be aware of him. You probably do know who he is. He tweeted out something last night that got a lot of attention. Let me show you this on the screen. The Dan Orlovsky tweet here, putting out that he was hearing that big things are happening in Athens at Georgia football with the fire emoji. Now, leave that on the screen just for a second if you don't mind, because that in and of itself is not necessarily big news, right? I mean, Georgia has, as you may be aware, won the last two national championships. So typically speaking, there's always big news here around the Georgia program. The Georgia is just one of those programs that just sort of lives in sort of a perpetual big news state here. So Orlovsky's statement at face value didn't necessarily mean a lot to a whole lot of folks. But if you're watching on video and you see down there in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, there's a little, blurb thing there that says this tweet had been edited. It was last edited at 8:53 p.m. So if you go and look at the previous version of the tweet, this was Orlovsky's newest version of that, but there was an original version of the tweet that actually provided a little bit more information. Let me show this to you. This was the original version that maybe Orlovsky sort of thought was... Maybe he thought that was giving a little too much away. So the original version of the tweet said, hearing big things happening in Athens at Georgia football. Most talented player at the position since Matthew Stafford. Wow. All of a sudden that gets more interesting. Now I saw some folks that sort of saw that tweet, and I saw some folks that thought that was some sort of statement maybe about Carson Beck. That Dan Orlovsky was like sort of planting his flag about how good he thought that Carson Beck was going to be this upcoming season. I think most Georgia fans, or at least a good number of Georgia fans, realized that wasn't the case. The story here to understand is that Dan Orlovsky is a former Detroit Lions quarterback. And while he played for the Detroit Lions, one of his teammates was Dominic Raiola, who just happens to be the father of the nation's number one recruit, the five-star quarterback Dylan Raiola. So while some folks were kind of thrown off by Orlovsky, who doesn't typically tweet about recruiting, what he was saying about Georgia football, I think a lot of folks sort of realized, no, in this case, this is Orlovsky kind of making a statement about the son of his former Detroit Lions teammate, Dylan Raiola. Obviously, as I said before, Orlovsky played with Dominic. And lest there be any doubt that that's what was going on here, lest there be any confusion about what exactly was meant by the somewhat mysterious tweet from Dan Orlovsky, we eventually got a retweet that spoke volumes on this. Let me also show you this. This coming from what I'm assuming must be, I'm not familiar with her, I'm assuming must be Dylan Raiola's sister, who upon seeing the Orlovsky tweet, she provides a quote tweet retweet with a string of bulldog or dog emojis going across. So if there was any confusion whatsoever that the Orlovsky tweet was meant to be about Dylan Raiola, Taylor Raiola here, who seems to be an athlete in her own right, very good volleyball player it appears. The Taylor Raiola tweet, and by the way, I'm sure she's probably going to get a lot more attention than she ever realized. The Taylor Raiola tweet here, I think, would seem to remove all doubt that what Dan Orlovsky, the ESPN analyst, is talking about here is something being up with five-star quarterback Dylan Raiola, which kind of leads us to a question here. Okay, well, what's up here? I mean, there are a lot of Georgia fans who sort of think that eventually Dylan Raiola is going to commit to Georgia. We've been kind of on commit watch for Dylan Raiola one time before, and for whatever reason that didn't quite materialize. So why is it now that this seems like a more relevant conversation, or a relevant conversation once again after a couple of weeks of being quiet? At one point in time, there had been some chatter this might be going down. Well, for answer to that question, let me go back to Friday's show here for a moment, because I started my interview with Jeff Sentell, our DawgNation recruiting insider. He joins us each and every Friday on our program. And I was talking about the fact that it looks like that Jeremiah Smith, the five-star wide receiver, current Ohio State commit, really one of the top players in the country in his own right there as well. If Raiola is the very best player in the country, Jeremiah Smith is honestly not too far down the list and all that. And so we were talking to Jeff, and I was talking about the fact that it looks like it's official. Jeremiah Smith's going to take an official visit, but we've seen Ohio State really win with receivers before, and just it's a very typical conversation to one we often have with Jeff Sentell here. But in the midst of talking about Jeremiah Smith, Jeff also kind of revealed something to us about Dylan Raiola. And if you kind of want to know why it is that the Raiola topic is sort of resurfacing, why it's bubbling back up, maybe Jeff's answer on Friday could be part of the reason why. Here is the answer that Jeff gave on Jeremiah Smith that also kind of pivots back in the direction of the guy who might throw the ball to Jeremiah Smith, were Smith to come to Georgia, five-star quarterback, nation's number one recruit, Dylan Raiola. This is Jeff from Friday.
I don't think the Georgia flip happens without the Dylan Raiola connection there. And really, if you want to, I know you love the reading between the tea leaves section. What it should tell the very smart DawgNation reader is Jeremiah Smith's going to be in Athens next weekend for the scavenger hunt, and that's cool. But what it likely means is Raiola will also be there with him as well, because I don't know if that's the most effective official visit for Georgia. If not, if there is the potential connection synergy there with a potential five-star quarterback commitment as well. That's like wide receivers and quarterbacks, they go hand in hand.
Okay, let's understand what Jeff is saying here. So Dylan Raiola is already slated to take his official visit to Georgia the first weekend in June. It's the only official visit that Raiola has scheduled right now. But what Jeff is also telling us is prior to the official visit in June, where Georgia gets to pay his way to travel from Arizona to UGA for the official visit, he is also planning, as Jeff reports there, on taking an unofficial visit for the upcoming scavenger hunt, which I guess is this upcoming weekend, I guess. He's also planning on taking an unofficial visit for the scavenger hunt, because that's when five-star wide receiver Jeremiah Smith's going to be there. So get this. Just prior to taking an official visit, Raiola is also taking an unofficial visit. Well, in the old kind of idea of, the old parlance of follow the visits here, what I told Jeff on Friday's show, I'm going to reiterate to all of you right now. There are a lot of folks who are sort of waiting, when's Dylan Raiola going to announce? When's Dylan Raiola going to announce? When's he going to announce that he's committing to Georgia? Well, if Dylan Raiola is taking an unofficial visit, like basically a week prior to taking an official visit to Georgia, so we can, communicate with wide receivers, I'm not even quite so sure that Dylan Raiola needs to announce. Yeah, I'm not even quite so sure there's really all that much to officially saying, I'm coming to Georgia, when the obvious operations behind the scenes seem to be taking place with the assumption that Raiola is coming to UGA. So much so that this somewhat mysterious Dan Orlovsky tweet is actually not being treated as mysterious by the Raiola family. Dylan's sister, more than happy to retweet it, put the dog emojis on there and things like that. The operation right now is that Dylan Raiola is coming to Georgia, not just to visit, but to stay. And I'm not really quite so sure that the actual commitment announcement in itself necessarily changes all that much about that. I think that, to me, has been one of the most fascinating things about this entire process throughout the duration of time it's been playing out, is the Raiola family has just not really felt all that much need to kind of keep this secret or play the game. And, there doesn't seem to be a lot of hat show right now. There doesn't seem to be a lot of other suitors for Raiola's services. This is the point that I've told you, many times in the past, is that sometimes this kind of stuff can be figured out by process of elimination. USC long ago has seemingly waved the white flag on this recruitment. Another school we heard about for a while, Nebraska, they've also seemingly, even before that, waved the white flag on this recruitment. It sort of seems like all there really is left is Georgia, and the only question to be answered left is, when will Raiola actually make this official? Well, based on the fact that he's apparently coming into Georgia here this upcoming weekend, and what his good family friend Dan Orlovsky says, this may be happening sooner rather than later. So if you're a Georgia fan, you're probably already leaned in, tuned in, and paying very close attention to this. Every indication I have, every suggestion, thing that can be made about all of this would certainly lead you to believe this is going to be a very fun summer for UGA fans. Now, let me also say one more kind of thing about this, which is, from like 10,000 feet from outside the bubble of DawgNation, this sort of seems like, well, this is the way that things are supposed to play out. Georgia's obviously won the last 2 national championships. It ought to be able to just sort of throw open the open for business sign and attract and bring in whatever recruits it wants to be able to, because of how attractive the program is, both to guys in-state and some of these national recruits there as well. But Kirby Smart pointed out something a few days ago when he was on WJOX. That's the sports radio station in Birmingham. Smart visits with them every summer because he plays in that region's Pro-Am thing prior to the PGA Tour Champions event there at I think it's Greystone Country Club in Birmingham. He always does the radio interview prior to kind of playing in the golf tournament there. And the subject of kind of national recruiting and players the caliber of Raiola, although Raiola wasn't mentioned by name, kind of going out to Arizona and getting a quarterback when you need to and things like that. Kirby Smart, I think, rightly points out in this interview that this job doesn't get any easier for players like this simply because Georgia's won the last 2 national championships. So in light of what might be going on with Dylan Raiola, what Smart said about the program's recruiting efforts the other day, I think, is worth repeating once again. Here is Kirby from WJOX.
How much do you really have to recruit?
A lot.
Really?
I mean, it's competitive. I mean, it's not, I'm just going to go to the school that wins the most. I want to go where I can be taken care of NIL. I want to go places. I mean, you've got to search the country for the best players.
So I think that Kirby Smart's words there should be taken very, very seriously. It's competitive. It's very competitive for a guy like Raiola. USC really wanted him bad. Nebraska, who's got a big new head coach and kind of a shiny new NIL fund, they wanted Raiola bad. But it seems like right now, hey, not in the barn, of course, but it seems like right now Georgia is poised to win this recruiting battle. So if and when Georgia does it, it's the kind of thing that Georgia ought to be given a lot of credit for. And specifically, a guy that I think we're going to hear being very instrumental in all of this is the brand new Georgia offensive coordinator, Mike Bobo. This is a guy who has had a lot of questions asked about him of how good of a fit is he right now in his second go-around as UGA OC. How much can he do to maintain the great success that Todd Monken was having over the course of the last couple of years? Well, if the Raiola recruitment stands as your evidence, it could be that Bobo isn't just maintaining what Todd Monken was doing. It could be that he's ready to take it to a new level. Winning with the caliber of recruit that Georgia just wasn't winning with the quarterback position while Todd Monken was offensive coordinator. That's the kind of thing that Mike Bobo ought to get some credit for. Now, I realize if you're a Georgia fan, you're ready for this to be kind of over and done. You're ready for this to be official. But pay attention to all of the evidence here. What Jeff said about Raiola coming in for the unofficial visit. What Dan Orlovsky says. What Raiola's family is willing to do in kind of interacting with the Orlovsky tweet. They're pretty comfortable right now having it be out there that they are very, very interested in Georgia. Will they follow that up soon with a commitment announcement that makes it kind of all sort of nicely tied up and wrapped up and over and done with? It seems like there's a chance that might be the case. If you're a Georgia fan, my advice to you over the course of the next few days, pay very close attention. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella, a window and door of Georgia. Happy to have you with us, no matter how you get to us. Live on video, we start at 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app, 10 a.m. after that on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. So many different ways for you to catch up with us there. We're just glad you sort of pick one of those and do that. Same thing for our radio audience there on 960 The Ref every single day at noon. We love being on the radio in the Classic City, and then as a podcast, wherever you find them, the Apple Player, Spotify, worldfamousDawgNation.com. Some of you listen directly on SoundCloud. A lot of different ways for folks to check out our show. We're just glad you picked one of them and use it. We're so thankful to have you as a part of what we do. And for all of the moms in our audience who celebrated yesterday, we continue that celebration and extend our just thanks to all of you for being such great moms. Those, my mom and the mom to my kids, but also just good moms benefit our society overall for a million different reasons. So thanks to all the great moms out there. And by the way, if you wanted to do something sort of post Mother's Day that'd be really nice for the mom in your life, be it your wife, whoever else, how about some great windows and doors? That's the kind of thing that moms always love. They love their home looking better on the outside. They love it when it feels better on the inside. And that's the kind of thing that Pella Window and Door of Georgia is all about. Energy-efficient windows and doors, really the recognized leader when it comes to this particular product. You know, survey after survey in the Atlanta area, year after year, have kind of indicated that when folks say, okay, if you want the best, what is the best? Well, the brand that's viewed to be the best is Pella Window and Door of Georgia. That's why we say Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best. It's not just a slogan, although it is a good slogan. It is really reality in terms of how people see these great windows, these great doors. Now, you may say, well, BA, I'm not an expert on windows and doors, so how am I supposed to learn this for myself? You can actually stop by and see them, what they call their Experience Center there in Duluth. I've actually been there. It's a really nice place. It's a really amazing warehouse facility, but it's also the kind of thing where they have a showroom, and you want to touch the doors. You want to feel what makes it superior. I like to hold things in my hands. I like to touch it. I like to feel it. And those windows, the just the substantial nature of them, the doors, the hardy feel to them. This is one of those things that you can see for yourself. You can feel for yourself when you stop by and see them there at the Experience Center in Duluth. Now, for some of you want to kind of do your thing online or have kind of a less intimate conversation before you do anything face-to-face. You can take care of that there, too. Give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. Also find them online, pellaofga.com/DawgNation. Once again, pellaofga.com/DawgNation. And don't forget, great savings. A few more days, take advantage of this. Between now and May 22nd, you can get 10% off your entire project or 0% APR for 24 months. Now, it'll be interesting to see. Does Dylan Raiola commit to Georgia before this offer from Pella expires? That'll be interesting to see. It'll be an interesting thing to measure and judge. But the point is, great savings, great opportunity with our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia. But when you reach out to them, make sure you tell them that BA from DawgNation Daily said that they would take good care of you, because I know they truly will. Pella Window and Door of Georgia, they bring the show to us today, and they are viewed to be the best. All right, we're going to get Jon Stinchcomb coming up in a moment. Great conversation with him. I'll talk to Jon about the Raiola thing here for a little bit. Obviously, Jon's not a recruiting analyst or anything like that, but certainly if anybody's going to be excited about having great quarterbacks at a place like UGA, Jon Stinchcomb certainly an example of that, so we'll have that conversation coming up. Prior to that, though, let's go around the Dawghouse. And I mentioned earlier that Kirby Smart was on WJOX, sports radio station in Birmingham last week. Another one of the topics that kind of came up during that interview, and I'll put a link to the full interview because I think it's worth your time to hear it. A moment ago, I played a short clip of Kirby talking about recruiting. Kirby actually had a much longer sort of thing to say about that, kind of comparing in-state versus out-of-state recruiting. That's a topic we end up addressing a good bit around here. And I told you the other day, kind of like Canadian Football League stuff, where there's a rule that you have to have so many Canadians on a Canadian Football League team, because obviously if teams had their way, they just have nothing but Americans, and the Canadian Football League wouldn't feel quite so Canadian. Well, I'm sort of the same sort of thing unofficially about Georgia. Hey, listen, I like getting the national player from here and the national player from there. Go to Arizona, go to Nevada, go to California, go get the best players. But I need some Georgia boys on my team too. I need some guys to sort of know what makes Georgia Georgia. There's a certain percentage of those you sort of feel like we always sort of have to have. And Kirby talked more about at least an idea related to that on the WJOX morning show with Greg McElroy and Cole Kublik the other day. So I'll put a link to that. You can hear the full interview because I think it's worth your time to do so. But kind of along those lines is that, it's those players that sort of understand what makes Georgia Georgia that helps establish the culture around Georgia. And we live in a time right now in college football where there's more roster change than ever. And there are some teams who've sort of made transfer portal recruiting, going out and getting players who once played for other places. They've made the bedrock of their talent acquisition process, that the number one way they're looking to fill their roster right now is seemingly through the transfer portal. Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss makes no apologies about this. We're seeing teams like Auburn and Florida try to be very aggressive in the transfer portal here during this offseason. And by contrast, Georgia's just not quite like that. Now, they have taken 3 transfers for this season, and we think all 3 of those have a chance to be pretty impactful in their own right. But in terms of the overall transfer portal philosophy, we've heard Kirby Smart address this a number of times. The most recent example of that came on this WJOX radio interview the other day. So here is Kirby kind of talking about how they manage the portal, both in terms of Georgia's willingness to take players, but unwillingness to make the entire roster be about who's portaling in and who's portaling out. I think this is another example of kind of what makes Kirby Kirby. This is really good stuff. Take a listen to this.
It's based on need. It's based on fit. It's based on who we knew coming out. We're not just doing a shotgun approach where we just spray it out there and say, we number one, we think the players we get out of high school are the higher quality. Then we say, okay, how can we develop them and keep them in our program? And then ultimately, if we have a spot available, we want to take somebody that we knew something about beforehand. We had them on official visit. We had them work out on camp. There was a common bond there. They understand what they're getting into because it's a little different at our place, and we try to sell it that way. And sometimes that works out, and sometimes it doesn't.
So let me ask you a question. Why would Kirby Smart say that a player they could take out of high school is a higher quality than a transfer player? Why might that be? Now, there potentially could be a lot of answers to that, but let me highlight one in particular here. Kirby has said in the past that when they recruit a player out of high school, their hope is to have a retention rate of about 70% with those players. In other words, they want more than 2/3 of the players they sign out of high school to stay with Georgia for the duration of their career, which should be 3 years, 4 years, something like that. To me, that's what makes a high school recruit of a higher quality, all things being equal, of a higher quality than a player from the transfer portal, where you're at the most getting one of those guys for maybe 2 years. Most portals are going to be kind of a rental player, 1 year type situation. That the impact you can make in your program recruiting a player out of high school is just far greater, far larger, because those should be 3-4 year type situations. And those become players who become part of the fabric of your program that help contribute to your culture. And so your culture is always going to be more enhanced by high school recruiting than it's going to be by transfer portal recruiting. And I believe that's what Kirby Smart certainly could have meant by that, and maybe even that's what he did mean by that, just based on the statements that he's made in the past. But as Kirby kind of pointed out, that doesn't mean that Georgia won't be willing to take a transfer portal player when it kind of fits the overall needs of the program. The way that I think about this is, and maybe this is a corny analogy, but I'm kind of a corny person, so it would be appropriate if it was. Think about this, is that Georgia doesn't want the transfer portal players to be the main course. Georgia wants the transfer portal players to be the seasoning to the main course. That the main talent acquisition opportunity for Georgia is what it gets coming out of high school. That's the fabric of the program. But if you can season that, if you can spice that up by going out and getting a couple of wide receivers who led their teams in receptions a year ago, or a former elite recruit like Deion Bowie, who Georgia was interested in when he was himself in high school, that becomes the kind of seasoning and spice that can kind of add more pizzazz to the overall meal that Georgia's trying to serve up. And I would say that works out pretty well. Because what Georgia ultimately wants is a large number of long-term players that help establish and maintain a culture that's clearly working for Georgia. And when it goes out and seeks a player from the transfer portal, it not only wants a talent and a position of need, but someone who's willing to kind of come in and buy into the culture that was established before those players got there. In other words, if you've got too many transfer players on your roster, then all of a sudden you run the risk of reaching a tipping point where too many guys from other places have kind of made your culture unrecognizable because all these guys have no connection to what you had prior to them arriving here. We think that may have happened to Alabama this past season. But at Georgia, the culture is preserved by having a large number of players who've been here for multiple years and a small number of players who bring some talent from another place who want to step in and fit in well with what Georgia's already doing. Now, the perfect example of that may be Dominic Lovett. I thought Mike Griffith had a good story at DawgNation.com this morning, citing an interview that Lovett had done with the Players Lounge. The Players Lounge is one of those NIL type things that's out there. They also do some media opportunities. with some of these Georgia players. I believe this is the first time we've heard from Dominic Lovett in any fashion. I don't have the audio for you on this, but I do have a quote from Mike Story from having watched the video with Lovett, and I'll put a link to all this when we post the show a little bit later on there as well. But this, to me, is the embodiment of what Kirby Smart says, where, hey, we're going to be judicious. Now we use the transfer portal, and we go out and bring a player in for the portal. We don't just want him to be a talented player. We don't just want him to be a good fit for us. We also want this to be a guy that understands what the Georgia culture is all about. Let me show you this quote from Dominic Lovett that I think is the perfect example of this, where Dominic says with the Players Lounge, I've never been a part of something like this. It's really amazing how we connect on and off the field. If you actually know your brothers next to you and why you're doing this, why you came here, why you're staying out there, you're just pushing and pushing. I feel like it's different, Dominic Lovett says. You can read more of that at DawgNation.com. And, of course, there's an interview with the Players Lounge. You can watch the entire thing if you want to do that. That, to me, is what Kirby Smart wants from a transfer player. It's someone who understands that this isn't just a pathway for me to go to the NFL, although in Lovett's case, I'm sure it certainly could be. But this is also a place in which, hey, players grow to know each other. There's a connection piece here that's really, really important. And you're asked to make a sacrifice for your brothers, they call themselves. You're asked to make a sacrifice for your brothers out there in the football field, and it actually feels good to do that. It feels good to contribute to a cause that's larger than yourself. At least if you're going to be comfortable at a place like Georgia, you have to believe that. And it seems like someone like Dominic Lovett does. So what Kirby Smart says about the transfer portal in the interview with WJOX of the day, that's not lip service. That's not just fancy words. It's actually embodied by the kinds of transfers that Georgia seemingly has brought in, including Dominic Lovett, who had some great things to say with the Players Lounge the other day. And you read more about that in Mike's story there at DawgNation.com. We will make that around the Dawghouse for you here today. Now, before we are done, we're going to look at a couple of different things. First of all, speaking of transfers, while the situation at Georgia seems to be going very well from a transfer standpoint, adding a small number of players to go along with what's already a talented roster, there are other programs, hint, hint, lousy stinking Gators, where things don't seem to be going quite so well. We'll give you the facts on this, let you judge for yourself on that before we are all said and done today. Also, a very funny golden shoe related to a topic that in some form or fashion was kind of a big one here this weekend. College football fans, Georgia fans included, don't need a whole lot of reason. Want to go back and forth from time to time. There was a sort of a weird issue that kind of got Georgia fans and one of its hated rival fan bases kind of going back and forth, so we'll share that with you before we're all said and done there today as well. But for now, on everything, including some of the Raiola stuff we were just talking about a moment ago, let's get ready to bring on the former UGA All-American. It's Jon Stinchcomb here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella, Window and Door of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Happy to have Jon Stinchcomb on the program. And as I told our audience before, Jon doesn't make any bones about the fact that he doesn't do what Jeff Sentell does for a living. He's not a recruiting analyst. But, Jon, you're like anybody else, a sort of a stakeholder in the Georgia program here. And I think it's certainly exciting to see the recent momentum that seems to be building for Georgia, possibly adding nation's number one recruit, 5-star quarterback, Dylan Raiola. And I guess let me start with this. The Raiola stuff right now seems to be very different in a lot of recruiting situations in the fact that they don't seem to be cultivating a lot of drama. They're obviously not, as of yet, officially announcing the commitment. I guess that could come at any point in time here. But they don't seem to be working very hard to keep it a secret that they're very interested in Georgia, and that maybe all of this is certainly destined to land with Raiola at Georgia, not really pushing back against the Orlovsky tweet, seemingly okay that it is even out there. What do you make as someone who's kind of like me, just sort of observes recruiting, doesn't necessarily report on recruiting, the fact that the Raiola clan here at the moment seems content to have it be known how interested they are in Georgia, while they also kind of go through a deliberate pace about eventually announcing that? They don't seem to mind folks knowing that's where all this is seemingly heading. A little bit different than what we oftentimes see, is it not?
Yeah, it is, and I'm appreciative of it. It's amazing how many times folks want to play the cloak and dagger game and make it into more of a spectacle than it probably needs to be. And I think some of it's just to generate interest and feel like you're a storyline, and other folks, I think the Raiolas are a prime example of this, is they're just going through the process, and the circus that surrounds them is less of a focus for them. if you all want to make it into a big deal, you're welcome to. But for us, we're just trying to find the right next step, and not really worry about, are we disguising our intentions to generate enough buzz? That doesn't seem to be the concern there. I think for Georgia fans, this is an exciting development because you talk about some talent, and having not brought in a quarterback this past cycle, it's a great opportunity to kind of continue that legacy of what's being created in Athens. And I think, as we led into the draft, you and I talked about, well, if Stetson gets drafted, will that help? And obviously, not only did he get drafted, but it was a fourth-round pick.
Yeah.
And it bodes well for any future quarterback that looks at Athens and says, this, although running back is a marquee position, it is a great opportunity to come in as a quarterback.
I'm curious about this. It seems like recruiting is a little bit different now than it would have been years ago. Let's say that you were an elite offensive line recruit now, the way that you would have been when you originally came to Georgia. Would the presence of a guy like Raiola have made you more interested in UGA? It seems like, these quarterbacks are sometimes what we call like Pied Pipers, or they have coattails where other players want to come to Georgia because of them. How much would that have swayed you when you were a player, knowing the nation's number one recruit was spending so much time around Georgia, seemingly on the verge of committing to Georgia? How much would that have given you maybe sort of a fear of missing out if you weren't kind of a part of all the buzz and the energy that was happening around Georgia with a guy like that seemingly at the center of all of it?
Yeah, I think it's a factor. I think it's something that you take into the equation because you want to win. And I think if nothing else, what's been proven is you got to have good players to begin with, and you try to pool them together. I know when I was being recruited, you'd see a lot of the same faces at the big games and the big schools on those hot weekends, and you wanted to try to rally the troops and find that one destination so you could make a big difference. I think you look at my class in particular, and you saw that a lot of those names were some of the bigger names that we tried to find that same place. Now, granted, most of us wanted it to be Georgia. I think you look at the legacies of, I was in the same class as Terrence Edwards and Boss Bailey, and my last name being Stinchcomb. Those weren't foreign last names to the Georgia fan base, but we were certainly doing a good bit of recruiting for some of the other players, and that's not lost on these current classes. I think you look at a guy like Raiola and you say, man, that is a good base to start from if I want to be successful. And I do think when you're on better teams, one, not only is it more challenging in practice, but two, it makes everybody feel a little better and play a little better and look a little better. And, you look at the all-star teams and it's usually guys predominantly from good teams. That doesn't mean that, lesser teams don't have some good players, but they certainly are harder to find.
Let me also ask this, because a lot of fans bring this up where they wonder, well, all this chatter, why doesn't he just commit? Maybe, the next couple of days or next week or so, maybe he will, but up till now he has not done that. And what I've kind of said in response to this is the thing I'm kind of curious about to hear from your perspective. What I've said is, hey, if he's taking unofficial visits to Georgia, we have reporting that he's about to. If he's in regular communication with recruits, we have plenty of reporting that he's doing that. If he's sort of operating as if he's a part of this Georgia class, whether he officially commits or not, I don't know that that necessarily means all that much to me, because he's essentially operating as if he's a part of this Georgia class, and that's probably more important to me than the designation of committed or not. How do you feel about that, John? I mean, is this one of those things where, you do want to see him, I guess, kind of pull the trigger on this, or are you kind of like me, as long as he's kind of doing what he's doing, whether he announces it or not, it sort of seems like it still has about the same value?
Yeah, it's funny. We all have these selfish intentions, and, fans want to give me that security blanket. I'd love for you to go ahead and commit. I don't want the nebulous situation that I currently exist in of, get my hopes up that we might get, one of the best quarterbacks in this cycle, but he's not fully committed. So it's funny because I understand where all this is coming from. And for the Raiolas, I think what it is we're going to go through our process. And, whatever noise is outside of this decision is not of our own creation. He's obviously kind of set a calendar of events that he thinks his family and he needs to figure out what's the best situation for him. And I can appreciate that. I think sometimes we start to try to influence folks for our own selfish interests, and that's probably not in the best interest of the individual. So I think he's set a course. He understands his calendar, his timeline, and we're just going to have to understand and appreciate that from the outside.
And then one more on this topic, and I want to shift gears and talk about something else with you, and this may be kind of bearing the lead. This may be the most important issue of all. John, think about being a Georgia rival right now, or a competitor with Georgia for like championships, things like that. Can you imagine how demoralizing it must be knowing that Georgia just won national championships 2 in a row with a former walk-on, a guy that was kind of relegated to a backup role, and many people thought that's all he would ever be, and yet he emerges as a historic figure in the Georgia program. And in the sort of immediate aftermath of that, now Georgia seems poised to land the nation's #1 recruit, the 5-star, the polar opposite from a perception standpoint of what Stetson Bennett once was. And this is kind of a final frontier in a lot of ways for Georgia, especially when you think about the fact that big quarterbacks like this have a tendency to bring big wide receivers with them. That if Georgia kind of already shown you the line of scrimmage recruiting, the defensive recruiting, if it also adds this sort of like skill position, quarterback, wide receiver type stuff to go along with that, well, then now Georgia has that veneer of being impenetrable. And I would say that the arrival of a guy like Raiola to Georgia, if it does eventually happen, John, I think the only way you can describe that if you're a Georgia rival or a competitor to Georgia, that's demoralizing, isn't it?
It is, and it's the way I think most teams felt 6, 7, 8 years ago, looking at the Alabamas of the world, going, man, the rich keep getting richer. And when you've created a program like Coach Smart and the rest of the staff has at Georgia, that's what you're looking at, a juggernaut. You're looking at not only competing on Saturdays, but throughout the year for these players. And a piece of the equation now is NIL deals. And Georgia's not lagging in that department. Facilities, they're not lagging in that department. But first and foremost is winning. It's still the #1 recruiter. I want to be a part of a program where I can find personal success and we find success as a team. And that's what Georgia's been able to do in spades these past couple of years. And so that's going to be an uphill challenge for every team across the country. And Georgia's now the cupbearer. It's what we've been seeking after for decades, and we find ourselves in that position, and it doesn't seem like Kirby and his crew is letting loose. I mean, they have that death grip on what they think is the formula that it's going to take to remain at the top, and I'm a believer in it. Now, you talk about the culture and the identity. I heard a little bit of the show before I came on about the transfer portal, but what sticks out to me most is that there is an identity, there is a culture that a select few are invited to be a part of, and it sets them apart from everything else that's going on across this country.
Let me shift gears to a completely different topic for a moment. One of the things that kind of came up last week, which I think is really interesting, is the stadium renovation slated to take place in Jacksonville. Obviously, that's been the home of the Georgia-Florida game for forever and forever and forever. And I guess, John, to kind of jump to the last page here for a moment, all the chatter about this has sort of led me to believe that the future of Georgia-Florida in Jacksonville may be a little bit more alive than I kind of thought it was. I have been poised and sort of expecting to hear at any point in time. Last year, 2023 is going to be the last year, and these two schools, because there are option years available for 2024 and 2025. And I've sort of been under the assumption that with the SEC changing over to what we think might be a 9-game conference schedule, they're at least doing away with divisions. There's going to be a lot of different scheduling, whether they stay at 8 or go to 9. It's going to be a completely different scheduling model once you bring in Texas and Oklahoma. We know that for sure. And all of this change was going to just sort of mean the end of the cocktail party. But I guess the sense that I get based on some reporting, some of this coming from Andy Staples in The Athletic, some of this coming, from other places, including here at DawgNation there as well, where it sort of seems like the two programs, Georgia and Florida, actually really like getting this money from Jacksonville. And Staples has even suggested that in the 2 years that the stadium in Jacksonville might not be available, they might go play neutral somewhere else just because it's more lucrative than trying to host a home game in one of those 2 years, which once again leads you to believe that, hey, maybe the Jacksonville folks, if they're willing to pony up enough, may be able to find a way to kind of keep this there. So I guess let me ask this to you both as a UGA athletic board member, but also as just someone who kind of follows this stuff. Do you also think there's a chance that Georgia, Florida may actually live on in Jacksonville a little longer than some of us thought it was probably going to?
I think it's possible. I mean, I've certainly been paying attention to what's going on there. I think what's most likely when all the dust settles is, a 3-year rotation of home, and neutral, and that neutral being in Jacksonville. I think that's a very real possibility, but, there's so much still that's up in the air that it's still speculative. But I think at one time, being a part of or keeping the game in Jacksonville seemed unrealistic, and you hear a lot of chatter from all the various camps that there might still be some viability of keeping it there. And we've talked about it before. I love it there. I like the idea of playing in Jacksonville. I think it creates a unique opportunity and experience for fans and players alike. And I understand the discussion of recruiting and losing out on a big game, but I think it's a unique atmosphere that is a draw and a carrot for a lot of guys in its own right. So it'll be interesting as it plays out. I think most likely scenario is that 3-year rotation, though.
So that's interesting. That's very, very interesting. So let me ask you this way. So let's say that the facts as I laid them out are true, which is that, hey, this game actually pays them a lot of money, and that Georgia really likes getting this money. Now, we know Kirby Smart's been very clear. He does not like going to Jacksonville. He wants the game to be in Athens every other year and is willing to tolerate going to Gainesville in order to be able to do that. So you've got a 2-time national championship coach who wants one thing, but what might benefit the program financially the most is something different. Do you think that Georgia should say goodbye to the additional money the Jacksonville game brings in because it wants to make Kirby Smart happy on this, or do you think that Kirby Smart should kind of acquiesce on his wishes because of just how lucrative a potential contract like this might be?
I don't see Kirby acquiescing very much. I think once he has an opinion on a particular subject, I think it's pretty hard to move him from it. And so understanding the benefits of the recruiting picture and landscape for him, I think, is always front of mind. As for the money piece, I mean, it is. We're not talking small potatoes here, but you look at the overall aggregate of what's brought in and where Georgia's at financially. It's in a different place than a lot of other schools and athletic departments across this country. So I don't think that's quite the motivating factor that it could be in other places. It's something that's a part of the equation, but it's certainly because of the solvency. What's the right word there, BA?
Is
the
it
fact
solvency?
That Georgia's so financially stable.
Yeah.
Let's stick to words I know.
Me too. Trust me.
Yeah. And it's a factor, but it certainly isn't, the ultimate factor. I think there's other programs that would be more motivated because of where they stand financially and because of, Georgia keeps winning and the dollars keep coming in. It allows you to make some decisions that aren't just solely financially based.
All right, last thing for you, and my reason for asking you this is because of the various guests we've had on, of course, the last few weeks. I think you're about the only one who I think has expressed this opinion, and it kind of ties back to something we talked about a good bit last week, which is my belief that Carson Beck, in all but sort of title, has sort of basically unofficially established himself as the Georgia starting quarterback, whether he's been officially named that or not. And I had some pushback online about this, that there were some people who still believe the quarterback competition was a little more open than maybe I was giving it credit for being. And I remember, if you want to go back to G-Day, you said yourself that you thought that Brock Vandagriff was still alive with a chance to eventually, to potentially, I should say, potentially be the Georgia starting quarterback. And so I wanted to circle back on that right now. Is that still your belief that if I were to say, Beck's basically sewn this up and now it's about preparing him for this, that you would say that I'm wrong, that you do still believe, whether it be during the summer or in the early portion of the season, that Vandagriff is still alive enough in this competition that it's actually him and not Beck who could be the starting quarterback by season's end?
Yeah, I think if there were that much separation, right? I mean, obviously Carson had a great spring camp, and what we saw in G-Day was confirming of the talent and the development of his skills during his time here in Athens, those are all great signs. But I think if Vandagriff was looking at this scenario and the coaches are looking at where we stand right now and there's this huge gap, then I think we would have seen more action in the transfer portal. I think that's probably where my attention goes. Do I think Carson Beck ultimately will end up being the starting quarterback? Yes, probably so. But I don't think it's sewn up and written in stone, and it's his now. He's the front runner. He's the lead horse. But I do think if Georgia's proven anything in years past, and Stetson's a prime example of it in the quarterback room, that it is an open competition in that you have to perform if you're the guy, and if you don't, we've got somebody that you feel pretty good about. And quite honestly, it's probably a closer discussion than what we had when it was JT Daniels and Stetson was number 4 going into camp. So I think it's probably a lot closer than what it has been in years past, and it's due to the high quality of all 3 of the quarterbacks that are competing right now. And it's one of those that you have to perform on a regular basis. It's not what you did and now we're just going to have to make you work. We're going to develop as many guys as we can, and we're going to put the best 11 out there, which is an old adage, doesn't always hold true. And I think for Georgia, they've proven that they're willing to look at that depth chart and make some changes if guys are outperforming their backup role.
John, it is a fun conversation. I always love having discussions like that with you here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Hope everybody in your life had a happy Mother's Day yesterday, and certainly just look forward to many more fun conversations within the weeks to come, and you're getting ready to settle in and enjoy yourself. A nice little summer here, too, before fall eventually arrives. Thanks for being with us here today on DawgNation Daily.
Appreciate it, B.A. Go Dogs.
Yes, sir.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And like I said, some of that had kind of come up on social media here a little bit based on what we said last week. And, I mean, my opinion sort of is what it is on that. And I think one of the things that maybe some people kind of misunderstand is I did not go into spring practice expecting to be as convinced by Carson Beck as I was. If anything, I've tried to be honest on a couple of our shows. I may have had a little bit of a bias against Beck a little bit. Now, I try to give everybody who plays for Georgia certainly a fair shake, and as a Georgia fan, I want them all to succeed. But, I have to say there are a couple of things where I just wasn't quite so sure what Georgia was going to have in Carson Beck. I still think there are some people who think the task of replacing Stetson Bennett is easier than it actually is, and I think that's one of those things that has to be addressed at some point this year, no matter who the Georgia starting quarterback emerges. But I didn't go into spring saying, this is going to be a coronation for Beck. I mean, I think at one point in time we even talked about, hey, use the September games. Let Gunner start a game. Let Brock start a game. Let Carson start a game. Not only does that make Tennessee Martin more interesting if it's a sort of a showcase of a different quarterback, but it's a good way to have things figured out prior to the games that really matter later on this season. That's the chatter we were talking about in early winter, post-national championship, pre-spring practice. Those were some of the things that we were kind of saying around here. But yet, I mean, I think based on what you saw on G-Day, based on what you've kind of heard, whisper, whatever, I think the Beck was pretty convincing. And I think he has to be sort of treated that way. Now, as far as why didn't Vandagriff transfer, John's saying something interesting there of, well, if, Vandagriff really believed he was out of it, maybe he would transfer. I'm not quite so sure that's the case. I mean, we've seen backup quarterbacks step in and play in the SEC the last couple of years. And it's also important to note, and this is one of those things that maybe sort of hangs over the head of this conversation a bit, but, there was a February 1st deadline in order to transfer within the SEC. So the other thing for a guy like Vandegrift might be, kind of prior to his graduation, which we believe is coming pretty soon, prior to his graduation and prior to being kind of a graduate transfer type guy, his movement within the SEC was going to be more restricted because of when it happened. So maybe if Vandegrift does choose to transfer sometime in the future, it's actually within the SEC when that window is available to him, or maybe he never transfers and sort of waits his turn. I will say this to kind of go back to where we started the show today, and eventually we'll get to our SEC through. And I'm sure we'll do more on this at some point in time, especially if it becomes relevant because of a Raiola commitment. Even with Dylan Raiola on the Georgia roster maybe next season, I don't think any less of Brock Vandegrift, and I don't think any less of Gunnar Stockton. I truly do not. I think that Raiola is the nation's number one recruit. I think he is that for good reason. And if he lives up to his recruiting moniker, well, then obviously he'll just sort of roller skate his way into the Georgia starting quarterback job. That's just a fact. But Gunnar Stockton was a very good prospect in his own right. Brock Vandegrift was a very good prospect in his own right. I do believe that Georgia will stage a legitimate competition again next season, much the same way it is right now here, there as well. And so while we're going to talk about Raiola, and some people will probably say we hype him up, even if that is the case, we will be no less interested in either Vandegrift or Gunnar Stockton in any kind of future Georgia quarterback conversation as well. We still believe in both those guys, even if Dylan Raiola eventually joins up at UGA. Now, all of that said, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. There's nothing I'd love more than for Mr. Raiola to sort of seal all this up and make his pledge to Georgia prior to a little Royal Caribbean cruise vacation that I've got with my family coming up a little bit later on this summer. I would love that like nothing more. Of course, I just want it to happen, period, but happening sooner rather than later would certainly benefit some of my summer vacation plans. And speaking of summer vacation plans, so many of you have your opportunity to do that right now there as well. There's still some opportunities to get involved, whether you want one of those 7-night Oasis class sailings or a 3 or 4-night sailing on like Mariner of the Seas, Independence of the Seas. They go out of Port Canaveral, short drive from where we are here. There's all kinds of cruise itineraries that suit you. As I've told you before, my cruise searches always start with Perfect Day Coco Cay. That's always the place we begin with on something like that. But whichever Royal Caribbean cruise itinerary you think would be great for you, I'm sure it probably will be, including think about late summer, going to Alaska, places like that. Really, really fun to be doing all that right now. Great travel agent like Jessica Slater makes your cruise search even better and more enjoyable, so give her a call. 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. Get booked up on a great Royal Caribbean cruise here for this summer, late 2023, or think about Icon of the Seas, debuting January of 2024. And now that the music has ended, we'll start cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. But I'll make this somewhat quick. I don't have to, we don't have to do a ton on this today. But I want to talk about something I meant to talk about on Friday. Interesting piece, Tom Fornelli, CBSSports.com. I like power rankings. I like any kind of list that gets us debating and talking. We are in talking season. All this stuff is kind of good. So he's got his power rankings for quarterbacks the upcoming year. And if you kind of quickly scroll through his piece there at CBSSports.com, what you see is Caleb Williams 1, Drake May 2, Quinn Ewers 3, Michael Penix 4, Sam Hartman 5, Bo Nix 6, J.J. McCarthy 7, Jordan Travis, Florida State 8, Michael Pratt 9, Jaden Daniels 10. So the point is, of the top 10, he even has some honorable mentions: Dylan Gabriel, K.J. Jefferson, Joe Milton, Curtis Rourke from Ohio, who I actually don't even know, and Kate Klubnik from Clemson. So, but of the top 10 that Fornelli gives you in his power rankings, only one SEC quarterback right now. So what this tells you is there's a little bit of a transition year for SEC quarterbacks. Maybe, in other words, a good time for Georgia to also be making a quarterback transition if so many other of the league's programs are making transitions at quarterbacks. And it's kind of funny, he's got Daniels on here listed as the lone SEC quarterback, but as I've said before, and you've probably heard me say before, I'm not even quite so sure when everybody's fully healthy if Jaden Daniels is even the best quarterback on his own roster. And if the backup there, Garrett Nussmeier, who also did not transfer this offseason, I'm not quite so sure that Nussmeier isn't the better of the two quarterbacks, or at least good enough that he ought to have some sort of role here this year. I typically am not in favor of a two-quarterback system, but Jaden Daniels, who does have a prodigious skill set, he's clearly very good with his legs, and someone like Nussmeier, who we saw in the second half of the SEC championship game, can really spin it, that these two quarterbacks who both have kind of an elite trait, maybe you find a way to combine them and get something out of both of them here this year, might make sense to do that. The other thing that you can't help but notice with this list, you've got guys like Michael Pratt and Bo Nix and Drake May. A lot of quarterbacks who at one point in time people thought might transfer who didn't. That's really the story of this past offseason, is the quarterbacks that could transfer that didn't. Drake May could have made any team that he went to, boom, an immediate national championship contender, but he stayed at USC. Michael Pratt, a lot of folks thought he was going to Florida, stayed there at Tulane. A lot of quarterbacks, you don't even see a guy like Grace McCall on here, but he also stayed at Coastal Carolina. A lot of quarterbacks that could have transferred just didn't. And a lot of teams like Alabama had to settle for, instead of a guy like Sam Hartman, who's on this list, one of the 10 best quarterbacks, they settled for, Tyler Buckner, who may have been not just the backup at Notre Dame to Hartman, he may have been third string had he stayed there. So it's the story of who didn't transfer here that really, really matters. Then I'll give you one more thing about this list that jumps out to me. The game right now that everybody ought to have circled, the most interesting game to probably take place within the first 3 to 4 weeks of this college football season is going to be week 2 when Texas goes on the road to Alabama. And the guy that Fornelli has as his, third best quarterback, Quinn Ewers, I'm not quite so sure that isn't the basement for how low Ewers can be this year, and that as he plays, he's at least third best, if not climbing higher than that before the season's done. If you care about Heisman futures odds and things like that, I'd say right now Ewers, who I've seen around 20-1, that may be the best price you see on that moving forward. Quinn Ewers won the Texas starting quarterback job seemingly with ease. And it's not just Arch Manning, who may also only be about third string there right now. Think about a guy like, what's his name? The other guy. I'm blanking on Malik, whatever. That's a guy that seemingly had a pretty good spring there for them, so much so that he was apparently getting overtures from other places, but was never in doubt that Quinn Ewers was going to be the starter. There's a chance that Ewers is just really very good. He'll certainly be getting, we would believe, a lot of NFL draft attention a year from now. And going on the road to Alabama with almost certainly the better quarterback. Now, the Longhorns are still going to be a pretty big underdog at Alabama that particular day, probably more than a touchdown, but probably not double-digit points either. And Alabama lately has had a habit of when it wins games, it wins them close, and it's actually lost a lot more games recently than we're used to seeing the Tide lose, and they could have lost to Texas this past season. Everything about college football feels very different very quickly. If Alabama, who we already have some concerns about, they're taking transfer players right now from Louisiana Lafayette and places like that, and safety from UAB, everything about Alabama feels very, very different if they lose week 2 to Texas. By the way, it also kind of changes the fortunes for Texas potentially as well. But Quinn Ewers is a quarterback worth paying attention to right now. And Alabama-Texas, week 2, is a game worth getting very intrigued by here very early in the season, too. You can't help but notice that. A couple other stories here real quick. I saw where ESPN kind of profiles Hugh Freeze. Obviously this is all an attempt to kind of rehabilitate what is a very tarnished image on the part of Freeze. You can't say anything that hasn't already been said about his time there at Ole Miss, both in terms of sort of traditional football stuff, the recruiting violations, the non-traditional stuff involving phone calls to escorts and things like that. Clearly, it was not good for Freeze. He even dealt with some stuff there while he was at Liberty, but clearly it's the stuff at Ole Miss that probably matters to me more than whatever people want to say about his time there at Liberty. Just whatever on that. So this is the attempt to do all of that. Obviously, we know whether it should be or shouldn't be. What is true is that winning has a way of kind of making everything sort of look different, feel different. And I've said this, and I'll say it again. I think Hugh Freeze is actually positioned to win a little bit more at Auburn than maybe people initially realized. His early days here as Auburn coach, pretty effective usage of the transfer portal. I think pretty effective usage out of high school recruiting. This is a guy who's won games as a head coach before. I think Auburn's made itself a pretty good hire. Now, it could take a long time for that to be noticed by Georgia because the gap between Georgia and Auburn is pretty wide. Would it take quite as long for other SEC teams to regret the fact that Auburn made this hire? I don't think so, especially after next year when we kind of make the transition where one way or another, Auburn's not going to get stuck playing the entirety of the SEC West each and every year. They're one of the teams, even with playing Georgia and Alabama still likely every season, which they very well likely could still be doing. Even with that, they're still going to have more rotational games against easier competition, more opportunities for Hugh Freeze to sort of compare himself to a Josh Heupel or a Billy Napier or a Shane Beamer or whoever. That there is a chance here that Hugh Freeze not only is going to help resurrect Auburn to certainly prior to where it was before Brian Harsin took over, but coming in at the right time where the Auburn schedule also has a chance to get a little easier there too. I think the Freeze tenure here at Auburn's worth watching. Obviously, the piece there at ESPN.com, a step in the process here of making more people feel okay about the hire. But honestly, the fact that he's recruiting has already made some Auburn fans kind of come around to him a little bit in a way they weren't prior to then. If he wins a few games here this fall, pretty much everybody down there in the Plains is going to be on board with that. I'll also make mention here of the fact that I saw where Florida brought in a transfer offensive lineman, a guy who had been at FIU, was going to go to South Florida, and now he's coming to Florida instead. This is an experienced player. Listen, speaking of Auburn, we saw them take an offensive lineman from Tulsa the other day. That, as we've said now many times, that's just what the portal situation looks like right now when it comes to offensive line. The place where the portal has probably been the weakest and the softest has been when it comes to offensive linemen. Their programs have needed them, and they just haven't been there. Georgia not really needing to go to the portal for an offensive lineman right now, in other words, is an incredibly valuable thing. But if you want to know where Florida is as a program right now, it's stealing transfers from FIU away from South Florida. Be very careful about that, especially when it comes to the offensive line. For all the attention, what's not happening at quarterback is getting at Florida, potentially transitioning from a guy like Anthony Richardson, who had a great skill set, even if not always great in games, to a guy like Graham Mertz, who no one's going to call great in any way, shape, or form. For all the attention that topic is getting, pay attention to the offensive line situation in Florida. It is weak, and I don't know that transfers from FIU are helping it get any better, and that is cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And as we wrap up here today, one of the other topics that got some attention during the weekend is who was graduating and who wasn't graduating and who was graduating from where. Well, an example of that is the fact that Jalen Hurts, the former Oklahoma quarterback, which we always like to call him, got his graduate degree. And by the way, our penchant for wanting to call him a former Sooner would seem to be bolstered by the fact, as John Paul Williams points out, that Jalen earns his master's degree not from Alabama, but from Oklahoma. Oklahoma putting on social media, congratulations to Jalen Hurts on completing his master's degree from OU. They call him a Sooner for life. He's got OU DNA in him, they say. Tough look for Alabama here. Hard to call him one of your own when he's getting master's degrees from Norman there. John Paul Williams points that I think that's right. So they can say what they want to about whatever degree Stetson Bennett didn't get. But look where Jalen Hurts is going for his master's degree. You can't help but notice that will give John a golden shoe. And by the way, lousy, stinking Gators, speaking of them, 166 days from now, Georgia back in Jacksonville, beating up on Florida again. That is our Gator countdown. We will see all of you back here again tomorrow. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They will show up on time, do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that. All right, let's get your comments here, and we will get ready to get rolling on a Monday. Frederick Meredith, good to see you. Glad to have you as a part of the program here today. Thomas Tyson says, I know Bama fans aren't talking about degrees. So there goes Thomas there on that. Kenneth Holt says, Georgia's going to blitz all day on that weak offensive line quarterback situation there at Florida. I like the idea of that, Kenneth, for sure. Nature Gator says another example of BA's Florida ignorance. Both the Florida starting guards are injured going into the fall. So listen, Nature, if I'm wrong, that means you got nothing to worry about. So congratulations. If I'm wrong, you got nothing to worry about. So no need for you to worry if you know so much more about the situation. Let's see what else. Paul Moon says, I can't remember what year Blasky is. Didn't he come in class of 2021? So that makes him a 21, 22. In this day and age, because that COVID year is still out there, I've sort of given up on knowing what, I don't even use the word freshman, sophomore hardly anymore because it just feels like that word has so little meaning now, unfortunately. But Scott Harris asked about Warren Erickson. Erickson did move on from the program. He did. By the way, Memphis Dog calls Hugh Freeze huge sleaze, which is a funny play on words. UGA boy for life, Brunetti, on the idea of a defensive drop-off for Georgia. I don't know where you'd get there on that. I'm expecting very big things in the Georgia defense here this year. Frank Patterson says that Georgia will lose 4 starting offensive linemen this season. Yeah, I mean, Georgia's held on to a good bit of depth. I mean, keep in mind, and I know one of our commenters mentioned this a little earlier too, a guy like Micah Morris remaining with the program. So you got Blasky, who's a little bit of a Swiss Army knife. Green, who's probably a true tackle. But Micah Morris stays there. Monroe Freeling coming up. I mean, this is why, you got to get, one or two of those elite offensive linemen each and every year. But clearly, Georgia's – I mean, look, Cedric Von Prawn-Granger coming back was one of the biggest stories of the offseason because all of the chatter that you're saying is going to happen after this upcoming season would have happened now had Van Prawn decided to go to the NFL, which a lot of folks thought he was going to. So, yeah, eventually that payday is coming where you have to replace a guy like that who seems like he's been starting for 100 years. So, yeah, that's true. But for now, everything is great. And you are glad that guys like Morris, because if Micah Morris had gone to the transfer portal, I mean, he would have been salivated over. I mean, and I'm not being funny here. When Auburn is taking guys from Tulsa, when Florida's taking guys from FIU who were going to go to South Florida, what you have Oklahoma State guy going to Ohio State. I mean, there are not big-time offensive linemen walking through that door. We have chronicled that as much as we've chronicled anything over the course of the last couple of weeks, last month or so. If Micah Morris had gone to the transfer portal, he would have been very, very sought after. The fact that he didn't gives you an idea that he sees a bright future at Georgia, which I believe he probably should. Frederick Meredith also kind of pointing out something that somebody brought up the other day when it comes to the defensive line. Yeah, we'll see about that. I mean, right now the Georgia defensive line depth seems quite solid, and let's just see how we feel about that. A year from now, let's see who develops and who looks great. Kenneth Holt in the comparison between Texas and Alabama says they're going to have the quarterback receiver advantage by far. Certainly seems like that could be the case. Scott Harris says, who is our second team center? Well, I thought it was going to be, at one point in time, I thought it was going to be Blasky, but apparently it's not. So, yeah, that's a good question. Because at one point in time, I thought that's what Blasky was supposed to be doing. Kenneth Holt says the defense last year was one of the youngest that Kirby had. In other words, how could it be worse this year? Yeah, I mean, if anything, I think a lot of teams, when they look at what Georgia had in 2021, when they look at what Georgia may have defensively in 2023, they're actually going to regret the fact they didn't do more against this 2022 defense. This is the defense that, when you combine injuries with the fact that for all that was said about it, they really did miss 5 first-round picks off that defense a year ago. That's just a true fact. And so I think a lot of teams are going to regret the fact they weren't able to do more against that 2022 Georgia defense. Brady Pest Manager checking in. Always great to see Matt here. Says, Florida's program's a dumpster fire. Sunbelt Billy. I like that. I like that for sure. Frank Patterson also welcome our friends from Brady in today, which you'd love to see. Ben Sanders says, where do you see Dylan Fairchild in the pecking order? I see Fairchild still as a very bright prospect. I really do. I think that's a guy that's on the 2 deep, and I think when you're in that 2 deep situation, you are right where you need to be in terms of earning some playing time. I do. I think that Dylan is still a very bright prospect for Georgia. I really do. It's a great question, Ben. I'm glad you asked it. Thomas Tyson says the secondary for Georgia this season is going to be the best we've seen in some time. It certainly could be. Let me go over to Facebook here for a moment. All right, on Facebook, Zach Adams is very funny in here. Ken Holcomb says, if BA is wrong, don't call him ignorant, just point out the error. Did I say something dumb? I'm sure I probably did. Randy Hall predicting that Jared Wilson can be the future second team center. That's another one of those guys that Wilson's just, that's a guy a lot of people really like. The same way that Austin Blasky has gotten a lot of praise at tackle for being kind of an unheralded recruit that a lot of people believe in a big way. Jared Wilson's another one of those guys that kind of gets some of that there as well. Let's see what else. We may have a spammer in here too. Rick Wallace says whether or not Stetson graduated, no one's business but his. Certainly didn't affect the Rams' decision. Yeah, I mean, I think that's so overblown. And listen, obviously a lot of Georgia players are great students. They go on to get degrees and study hard things and things like that. I don't spend 1 second. You've never heard me. I mean, I'm just made fun of Jalen Hurts for getting a master's degree from Oklahoma because we like doing the back and forth between Bama fans about who gets to claim Jalen Hurts. What you do in your college classes is your business. It just really is. I am not an elitist when it comes to college educations. I'm just not. A lot of you graduated from Georgia. You're very proud of your diploma. I think you probably should be. That is just not the world that I live in. It's just not. I am not a credentialist. I'm just not. I am not. And I'm not necessarily against people who are. I don't really care that much about it. But I don't walk around with, who's got a degree and where's the degree from? What I care about is what people do in life. And so if people get a degree and they use it to great success, good for them. If people go on to great success, they didn't get a college degree, who really cares? Like, I am not a credentialist or an elitist when it comes to what kind of parchment you have hanging on your wall. William Camacho says that Brock Vandagriff's going to get some playing time this year when we're winning by 30-plus points in the fourth quarter. William, I like your thinking on that. I like your thinking a lot when it comes to that. Denise White-Loper pointing out something that we've heard, which when it comes to the offensive line positions, the 2024 recruiting class is actually thought to be a little lighter than it typically is. I don't mean smaller players. I mean just a smaller number of elite players. And this kind of thing is always going to be true when it comes to the big guys. Every now and then you see kind of a defensive line drought where there's just not a lot of great defensive linemen in a given year. And sometimes you see that along the offensive line. And that's the reason for that is the scarcity of the positions. The sort of athletic big men that a place like Georgia is going to want, those don't always come in equal numbers. Whereas in every class, there's always going to be a bunch of guys who can run. You'll very rarely see a shortage of those. The small athletic players who develop the good speed and things like that, those always seem to come in relatively equal numbers. When it comes to the more scarce positions, maybe sometimes quarterback, there'll be different years when different people have different opinions of the quality of the quarterback class. But certainly when it comes to offensive and defensive linemen, that valuable commodity that both sides of the ball certainly are, those do not always come in equal numbers. There are going to be some years in which there's a drought, and this year there is some thought that a little bit of a drought there on the offensive line side. That's why the recruitment of a guy like, say, Daniel Calhoun from Walton is going to be really important because there just aren't a lot of big-time offensive linemen to win with. Craig Jones says you can't have enough offensive and defensive line injuries, especially with enough offensive and defensive line type talent, especially with the injuries that take place, and I believe you're right about that, Craig. Sandy Price says it's always great to hear players, especially the ones we got from the portal, talk about how different it is at Georgia. Sandy, I agree with that. That works. That truly works. Truly works for me. It does. Matt Rukavina says, as a former Dean's List student and UGA degree holder, let me gently wag my finger at Stetson. There you go, Matt. Congratulations on that. And I saw where Cardell Jones had also poked a little fun at Stetson too, I guess, because somebody had written whatever, and, Cardell Jones was famous for, what was his thing? We didn't come to play school or something like that. And eventually he did graduate and, took a victory lap for that. But he kind of made a joke about Stetson and whatever. It kind of got some attention. As I said before, if you graduate from Georgia, you ought to be proud of it. But I am not really a credentialist about stuff like that. I'm just not. Let's see what else. Hugh Nash, that's very funny. Let me go over to DawgNation.com for a minute, see what folks are saying over there. Lee Burkett gives a bold prediction. If Bobo will turn Beck loose, he will set a single game or season passing record. Lee, we'll see how that plays out. Interesting prediction. Astro UGA says that Stetson was at Georgia for 5 years, plenty of time to get a degree if he wanted to. UGA haters think he was at Georgia for 6 years. Yeah, I mean, listen, as I said before, it just doesn't move the needle for me very much, and I'm not just saying that as a defense of Stetson. I can't think of any time we've talked about anybody else's academic performance in the show. We just don't get into stuff like that. We don't. If you got your degree from Georgia, you ought to be proud of it. But if you didn't get a degree from Georgia, I don't think any less of you as a Georgia fan. I just don't. I mean, I didn't graduate from Georgia. If you got a degree from Georgia and you're using that to have great success in life, then good for you. That's awesome. But if you figure out a way to get great success in life without spending, $200,000 on a college education, then good for you there as well. That's just kind of what that comes down to for me. DT says Stetson earned his PhD in quarterback play studying under Professor Todd Monken. That's funny, DT. That's funny. Randy says, will Florida get more offensive linemen from Tuskegee, Belmont, Abbey, Savannah Tech? Yeah, that's pretty funny, Randy. Pretty funny. Bill Russell wondering if the Michigan NIL fund is going to buy the Joe Moore Award this year. Yeah, part of me just hopes that Michigan sort of keeps winning it year after year after year after year, just kind of keep the bit going, because pretty clearly those Joe Moore folks love the Michigan offensive line. South Georgia Dog and Reggie Elkins kind of talking about an issue that's come up before of, well, how come Texas and Alabama are still playing if Georgia and Oklahoma can't? And as has been pointed out, this is the conclusion of that home-and-home series, whereas the Georgia-Oklahoma series would be beginning this year, and the home game return for Georgia would not be scheduled to take place until a few years from now after Oklahoma's already been in the SEC for a little while. I heard it directly from somebody pretty close who would know that Kirby still wanted to go to Oklahoma this year because he wanted the game. He wanted some tough competition for his team. He liked the idea of going on the road and getting a big win. Obviously assuming that Georgia was able to do that, believing certainly they would have a great chance to. But it would be financially very punitive to Georgia to play a road game without getting a home game in turn. You're talking about millions of dollars. One of the reasons why, teams are willing to pay directional school, FCS school, $1.5 million or whatever to come to Georgia or come to somewhere else is because they make far more money than that by hosting a home game. So if you go on the road without getting a home game for it, those are millions of dollars your program loses that it'll never see and really never have a chance to make up. So the SEC probably did Georgia a financial favor by asking them to cancel the series, but my understanding is Kirby still wanted to play the game. I heard that pretty clearly. PDT says, I said it here first, straight 8 and 28. Boy, that'd be fun, PD. Can't wait to be doing that with you. Stick says, do you think the loss of the cocktail party and other historic matchups will destroy college football as we know it? Would college football just become NFL Junior, change Kirby's stance on loving the sport, something like that? I think that's an interesting question. Now, I'll also say, as I told John, I'm a little more bullish on the thought that Georgia-Florida could actually remain in Jacksonville moving forward. In fact, I've been operating for a while now on the assumption that this season's cocktail party would be the last one. At the very least, I don't believe that's true anymore. I think the deadline is June 30th. I believe by June 30th, if I had to guess based on today, and I get things wrong all the time, so maybe I'll get this wrong too, but if I had to guess, sometime prior to June 30th, Georgia and Florida will announce they've extended the 2 games, or maybe even one game, for 1 year or whatever else. But I'm guessing we may hear something coming up before the summer's done, that there's going to be a Georgia-Florida game in Jacksonville beyond just this year. Now, what happens post-renovation and moving forward, I don't quite yet know. I'm not quite ready to say that this may come down to negotiations, and Georgia may drive such a hard bargain on this that Jacksonville just fiscally can't meet it. But as it stands right now, I'm not quite so sure that the Georgia-Florida series in Jacksonville is on quite as much life support as I originally thought. But to answer your original question, yeah, if you poke and prod at the traditions that make college football what it is, if you pick at that fabric enough, you can unravel the whole thing. You just can. And you could make it NFL Junior, and that would not be good. It just wouldn't be. Now, what college football has shown you is that the sport's pretty resilient. In other words, okay, you can sort of mess with this and mess with that, and the sport still somehow not only survives, it continues to thrive. But that doesn't mean it's impervious to change. And there are some dweeby little national writers who always want to laugh and, basically mock the notion that any kind of change could ever possibly be changed for the worse, and that somehow that, anybody who ever is any bit skeptical about change whatsoever, that they're, sky's falling types or whatever else. And that just shows those people's ignorance. It just does. Now, that's not the only thing that shows their ignorance, but it's one of the things that shows their ignorance. Because here's what we understand about life, is that systems are complex. And college football is a complex system. What makes college football college football? I don't know that we could fully define that, but we feel it, right? There are plenty of us that, and it's got nothing to do with any of the reasons that sometimes get cited. It just is. Some of us just like college football better. We just do. And it's not because the Falcons don't draft enough Georgia players, and it's not because the NFL is too whatever. Some people just like college football better, and they don't even really know what makes it better. They just know that it is better in their mind. It is a complex system that creates that feeling. And complex systems are one of those things where you can start unraveling one thing and it can produce an unintended consequence that you could have never even imagined. And that's why I think you ought to be careful about changing too much stuff with college football, including the rivalries and all the kind of weird stuff. There's a lot of stuff around college football that doesn't seem to make much sense. But all of it adds to a sport that's the second most popular sport in America, clearly. And what makes it different than the NFL is what makes it so popular with many of us. So do I think that college sports should take that pretty seriously? Be careful that you don't mess with the thing that makes you you? Yeah, I do. Do I think that right now there's some recklessness on the part of, the administrators and the players and everything else in between? Maybe poorly understanding that. Unfortunately, I think that might be the case. But it is the kind of thing you ought to be paying attention to. I think that's right. I do. PD also asking about the XFL championship this weekend. Arlington was 6-6 in the regular season and beat a 10-2 team in DC for the championship. Everybody gets a chance. Yeah, I didn't watch a ton of XFL this year. I watched, I think, maybe one game one time. The rules were so different, right? The rules were so different that I found that to be a little bit interesting, but I didn't watch a ton of that. Gville Dog, I don't know if this is Gainesville, Georgia or Gainesville, Florida. It says he hopes I'm wrong about the Georgia-Florida game, that we have to get it home and home. As I mentioned on one of our shows last week, I do realize there are a lot of you who do want that, and I have respect for people who feel that way. I think this is one of those things in which reasonable people can disagree. I want you to understand that when I say, I think there's a chance this Georgia-Florida game maybe survives a little longer than I anticipated, even though I am in favor of the cocktail party, I am not just saying this because I am in favor of the cocktail party, because I've been saying for a while now, I love the cocktail party, but I believe it's about to get canceled. Well, now I'm not quite as certain that it's going to get canceled. That may still happen, but I'm not quite as certain as I once was. PDT also says that Bob Stoops was the winning coach in the XFL this year. So there you go. Big game Bob coming up again. All right, let me go around the comment sections one more time. We'll get ready to go. Back on Facebook for a moment. Philip Jordan Wells says the XFL game was kind of good. That's nice to know, Philip. Yeah, some of the rules things that I saw I thought were kind of interesting. The way you line up for a kickoff I thought was kind of interesting, kind of reducing some of the – because what people don't like are sort of the headhunter plays where like the special teams guys just flying down the field and pow. They have the tacklers kind of lining up like right in front of the blockers, which I think probably increases player safety. And what was the other stuff? It's like instead of trying an onside kick, you could try like a 4th and 17 play or something like that. You can back it up and try a 3-point play instead of a 2-point play. There's a lot of interesting stuff. Paul Baker says that Bama looked weak on the offensive line last year, and even though they had an elite quarterback, they lost 2 games, could have easily lost 3 more games. My point is, it won't matter who we get as a future quarterback if we have a weak offensive line. Coach Pittman obviously referencing the offensive lines he had in the past. Yeah, I mean, I think that offensive line has been one of Georgia's great strengths the last couple of years. I think the most underrated aspect of Georgia's last 2 national championship games has been the performance of the offensive line. Somebody joked earlier about Georgia not winning the Joe Moore Award. They've never been fully credited with how good they were, but this has been the best offensive line in the country. This past year's offensive line, I think, was even better than the 2021 offensive line was. That Georgia, I believe, clearly understands how important it is to have a great offensive line. That's why they won national championships. And even with Raiola, if he were to come here, building the offensive line, as you say, will remain just as important. It also kind of brings me to another point. You mentioned the situation with Alabama. I was kind of thinking about one of the Alabama players this weekend a little bit. I think J.C. Latham, the Alabama offensive tackle, boy, I think he becomes a really important player right now because, there's a lot of uncertainty around the Alabama program right now. But a guy like Latham is thought to be, big-time draft pick, kind of a bedrock of that offensive line. Oftentimes, the presence of a great tackle can make all the offensive linemen's jobs a little easier and maybe make them a little bit more successful. I think Latham's one of the most important players in the league this year. If Alabama has any choice or any chance of being Alabama, if that has any chance of occurring, then getting the most from a guy like Latham, making sure you build an offense around and behind a guy like Latham becomes really important there. Scott Harris says this is an interesting point. He says there's a direct relationship between Joe Moore Award finalists and the college football playoffs. Scott, that's very, very good. We even said this last year that you looked towards the end of the season when some of those finalists first came out. We saw Bama on there. We saw Iowa State on there. We saw Alabama on there. What we said is the offensive line that plays the best down the stretch is probably going to be for the team that wins the national championship. And I believe that ended up being Georgia. You're right. Frederick Meredith mentioning Juju Lewis, the Carrollton quarterback. We talked to Jeff about Julian Lewis on Friday's show, Frederick, so maybe you get a chance to hear that. Greg Rosenberg also talking about something we talked about, I believe, back during our 1st and 15 this morning. He says, we haven't had a running back with Dwight Phillips Jr. speed since Herschel. Yeah, I don't think that people have fully processed how fast Phillips is, and I don't believe that people have fully processed just what a different kind of player that's going to be in the Georgia running back room. This is a very interesting development for Georgia, which has not always, recruited the in-state running backs lately as much as recruited the national-type guys, but they've gone in-state for Phillips here, even at the expense of some other players they maybe could have gotten, and he is a blazing speedster, like a world-class speedster. I think that's a big deal, William Perry, who's never shy about taking a shot at Stetson. There you go. That's pretty funny. Gregory and Tanisha Davis says, I only have a high school diploma, and I made over $300,000 last year. First of all, I think that's awesome. And, to find a way to make that kind of money without the kind of debt that college provides, I think that's great. I'm all in favor of that. I really am, and I just think it's awesome. Now, there are some fields in which it's far easier to succeed if you have a college degree. There are some fields where I don't know that's quite so true. For instance, if you're a capable salesperson, I'm not really quite so sure how much the college degree is necessarily benefiting you. But if you do want to be a lawyer, if you want to be one of those fields where, we've chosen to use college as the training mechanism for the job, then, clearly that's a prerequisite. But, one of the things you see some governments doing right now, and I don't mean to get into this, I'll say this and move on. There are some governments who are removing the college degree requirement for a lot of jobs that used to have college degree requirements. They're taking those away. In most cases, I'm in favor of that. In most cases, I'm in favor of removing a college degree as a requirement for certain kinds of jobs. Not doctor, not probably lawyer, but that, I like the idea of heavily questioning whether or not a college degree ought to be a listed job requirement for certain kinds of jobs. I do. Let's see what else. Frederick Meredith says, I'm not holding my breath on Raiola. Got a quarterback succession in place, and Stockton still has 4 years to play. And Frederick, what I said a little earlier, even if Dylan does come to UGA, it actually doesn't make me think any less of either Gunner or Vandergriff as a prospect. Buddy Lee Z says, we're the first team that won the championship going 15-0 with less than 40 sacks. You're right about that. Georgia's got I think, by far the fewest sacks of a college football playoff national champion. I believe that LSU had fewer than 40 in 2019, but they were like at 39 or something like that, if I'm remembering correctly. So pretty clearly that's an example of one of those benchmarks I'd cited for years that Georgia proved not to be, certainly a prerequisite, a requirement. They proved that. But the one thing I have said in response to that is, well, if you look at the games that Georgia played, Tennessee game, I believe they had 8 sacks. Ohio State game, they had 4 sacks. That was a game in which Georgia did not really play that great defensively, but Georgia needed all 4 of those sacks. And obviously, if you got 4 sacks in every game, you'd be well ahead of the 40 pace, 40 sack pace before a season came to an end. So Georgia was kind of a weird team in 2022. They really were. They were not an elite pass rushing team, but when they really needed to play well, they seemed to find an elite pass rush. I would have always doubted a team's ability to truly flip the switch whenever it needed to. That's the kind of thing that sort of easier said than done, but Georgia really did find a way to flip a switch in the small handful of games in which it really needed an elite pass rush this past year. Ducati Tech says, I wrench on motorcycles for a living, but I have a master's degree in linguistics. He says, sometimes life takes you in interesting directions. It sure does, Ducati. It sounds like a great job, certainly a fun job, especially if you love motorcycles. Kind of cool what life will sort of throw at you sometimes. Scott Harris asks a good question. He says, what is the final class that has an additional COVID year to play? I believe it's the class of 2022, right? The kids who came in 2021. That's the last ones, right? So that's it, right? Maybe it's the class of 21, but I think it's the class of 2022. Listen, no disrespect to these players. I'm ready for them to all be gone. I don't mean not play for Georgia. I mean, I am so ready for like the COVID extra year of eligibility not be there, because I believe that. So Carson, think about this for Carson Beck for a second. Like, a lot of people operate on the assumption that Beck is going to play for Georgia for 1 year and move on to the NFL, which he very well might. But as a member of the class of 2020, now keep this in mind. So he came into Georgia, class of 2020. He didn't play that year. So that's a red shirt. So that means in 2021, he would have been a redshirt freshman. And then in 2022, would have been a redshirt sophomore. So right now, he's a redshirt junior, okay? He's a redshirt junior. But he also gets a COVID year. So believe it or not, did you know that Carson Beck could play college football for 3 more years if he wanted to? He could play for 3 more years if he wanted to. Now, I don't believe he will, but... And I'm just sort of citing him as an example. This is how crazy like the eligibility thing is right now. And actually maybe it is the 21 signees who are the last ones with a COVID year. Maybe that is the case. But Carson Beck could be at Georgia for 3 more years if he wanted to be. That's insane. That's so confusing. So confusing. But yeah. Alan Hampton says, I was a lousy high school student, but ended up traveling the world with a 6-figure job and more benefits than you could imagine before I had to retire 15 years ago on disability at 55. Sounds like a fascinating life and a fabulous life. It sounds like it. Yeah, so I was a terrible student in high school, a little bit better student in college, got my degree. I've probably learned so much more, as an adult after my sort of official schooling ended than I ever learned when I was in school. It's just kind of a shame. Sometimes I was probably a little bit of a late bloomer in life, just generally speaking, in a lot of areas. And schooling and smarts and things like that is probably an example of that, where I don't know that I was emotionally and spiritually mature enough for some of that at that particular time in my life. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not against going to college. Obviously, I talk to Georgia grads on this show each and every day, and I'm proud for all of you, and I think you should be proud of the degree that you earned. I am. But I'm also just not much of a credentialist either. Buddy Lee Z also asked about the next coach to leave. Seems like every coach loves it here, but we can't keep them forever. And then Frank Patterson says, how about giving Dell McGee a big raise, which I'm all in favor of. I'm in favor of all these guys getting raises. And the one thing, Buddy, that sort of benefits Georgia is the fact they are paying their position coaches big bucks. And of all the things you do in a program, that to me is the sign of strength more than anything else. It's not how much you pay your head coach, and it's probably not even how much you pay your coordinators. It's can you get your position coaches close to that sort of $1 million number? Because while you can't keep these guys forever, you can keep them far longer. You really, really can. Because, look at Georgia's position coaches, Trey Scott and Todd Hartley and guys like that. They're clearly succeeding at their jobs. So therefore, their quality of life is pretty high. They're getting paid about what some coordinators make other places. So you won't be able to keep them forever, but they're also not in a hurry to leave. And I think that's a really good thing. So who are the most likely to eventually kind of look for that big promotion? The guys that I mentioned. I would say that Trey Scott's probably very close to becoming a defensive coordinator. Hartley's the interesting one because, someone's going to want what he does. Do they make him the offensive coordinator in order to get him to do that? But, that also means, I'm guessing that someone like Hartley wouldn't even entertain something like that if it's not massive bucks and also play calling responsibilities. But when you talk about, making that commitment, massive dollars, play calling responsibilities, it's just an interesting thing. It's like, Georgia has paid these guys well enough that they're just not needing to look around quite as much other places are. Plus, it's like, do you want to be tight ends coach at Georgia where this machine's going to keep humming for a little while here, or do I want to go be somebody else's offensive coordinator where my job security is sort of tied to how well this head coach performs? That's a tricky decision you're going to make there. All right, last things we're going to leave. Good stuff. Let me go back to DawgNation.com very, very quickly. That's not the right tab. Back over here on DawgNation.com for a moment. DT says, as a corporate executive recruiter, degrees from respected universities are highly important in my world. Certainly could be. Certainly could be. But, my wife's also an example of someone, who found a way to be very successful in a field in which now she's not working now, but, very successful in a field in which, fancy degrees and, good schools and things like that was considered very, very important. She didn't really have one of those, and yet I think she was just as successful as really anybody was during the period of time in which she was doing that work. So I get what you're saying. I do. And I absolutely don't question your lived experience on that. Yes, Randy Hall, unless it happens at a very odd time, if Dylan Raiola were to make any kind of announcement whatsoever, I would expect us to go live to cover that. I would. Let's see what else. Back on Facebook one more time. Anything else? Let's see what else. Anything else on Facebook? Good conversation all day long today, as always. Yeah, Dana Turk on the subject of, listen, it took me a little while to get my degree. There's something to be said for sort of sticking with it, especially for people, I think back in my day it was a little bit easier to do this than it is now because college has gotten so expensive. But back in my day, I went to Gainesville College for a couple of years, and back then it was only $300 something a quarter that you could work a little bit, you could pay for your education. It was not that hard to do. I don't know that the kind of affordable education option really even exists anymore the way that it did sort of back then. And so for some people, their pursuit of a degree would be slowed down a little bit because they were working to pay for it, and then they would pay for it, and they'd go to get some more schooling, and they'd work to pay for it, or they had to limit the number of classes they could take. Anyone back then, it was quarters or semesters now. They had to limit the number of classes they could take because they also had to do the work to sort of pay for the school. That kind of slows down the degree pursuit from time to time. But there is something to be said for that perseverance and stick-to-itiveness for sure. Let us see what else. Rick Wallace says Pepperidge Farm remembers. Yeah, sometimes y'all say that in the comment section. I'm actually a pretty big fan of that brand. I love their cookies. Like, to me, and this is free ad, those are the best, like, grocery store cookies, right? The kind of, like, not fresh baked, the kind of things you sort of rip off out of a package and eat. To me, those are the best grocery store cookies for sure. All right. So Craig Jones says everybody thinks the Raiola joins today. I don't know when it'll be, but we'll be ready for it whenever it goes down, if it indeed does go down. Nick Roundtree, I think you may be right. That may be the only way to pay for school on your own these days. All right, we got to go for now. Thanks for being here for our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Y'all check out our friends at the AJC, ajc.com. I don't know that you'd want right now to read about the rough weekend for the Braves up in Toronto, but you certainly can read about that. Maybe better to read a preview of the series coming up against Texas as they stay inside American League play here, hoping to turn things around. Kind of a weird weekend for the Braves. You can follow all of that. Also, you got rookie minicamp going on around the NFL, including here in Atlanta. So how the Falcons draft picks performing, you can find out about that. And by the way, I guess the farewell concert for Kenny Loggins took place in Atlanta this past weekend. A lot of hits there. So you can read more about that and I guess live vicariously through what you may have missed. Also, our friends at R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on that, including, it was hot this weekend, was it not? Saturday was, it's basically summer. Like legitimately like high 80s summertime temps. That means your air conditioning unit is cranked up and it is working full time right now. And if you're worried about it making its way through the rest of the summer that's still on its way, get some peace of mind by getting your unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs with our friends at R.S. Andrews. Find them online at rsandrews.com. Have a great day. See you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, then the R.S. Andrews cool down after that. We'll see you then, everybody.